So sterols are the next type of lipid, and there are two main groups of sterols that I'm going to just look at. The first one is cholesterol. So cholesterol we've got here, you can see it's got a very different shape from the fats. So that's why we talk about the different characteristics, like being hydrophobic instead of having specific, shapes or something like that. Now, it is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and these big rings are actually carbon rings. So you can see that they're all based on a structure of 4 carbon rings. Not just pointing that out, you don't need to know that about the sterols. Cholesterol, we're going to see this guy show up again later on because it is an important component of cell membranes, and it helps keep those membranes the structure that they are. And this is the other molecule that can cause problems as far as heart conditions, because this guy can attach to vessel walls along with those saturated fats and lead to things like high blood pressure and strokes and heart attacks. So that's cholesterol. And then the other group are the steroid hormones. So that's part of where that steroid name comes from. So there are artificial or synthetic steroids, but you do make natural steroids. The two are estrogen and testosterone. And my first question is, who makes estrogen? Who makes testosterone? And a lot of people think that this is a trick question because the answer is, as long as you're functioning correctly, everyone makes estrogen and testosterone. It's just we think of it as females make estrogen, males make testosterone, because females generally make more estrogen, males make more testosterone. But if you take a look at what they do, estrogen influences memory and mood, and testosterone stimulates muscle growth. And that's something, both of those are things that both males and females need. It's just that females need that estrogen in order to stimulate different things like sex cell production. Same for testosterone. And so they do have different amounts of them, but both sexes, as long as everything is working correctly, will be producing both of them, because they are going to influence a lot of different characteristics. So I mentioned this with cholesterol, that it is the components of cell membranes, and it can cause your blood vessel walls to thicken. This is the other thing that I just wanted to make sure I pointed out, because a lot of you have probably heard that you need to limit cholesterol in your diet. And this is why. You actually have 90% of your cholesterol that you need is actually produced by your liver. So your liver actually makes 90% of your necessary cholesterol, and you only need 10% of it to come from your diet. And so very often that's why your doctor will tell you to cut down the cholesterol in your diet, because that's the part that can lead to things like the heart disease and stroke. Steroid hormones, like I mentioned, everybody has them. Testosterone is more prominent in males. That's why they generally can build more body mass. So you may recognize the former governor of California. So this is Arnold Schwarzenegger back when he was a bodybuilder. And there are synthetic variants of testosterone. Arnold Schwarzenegger did not use them, but there are people who have used them. They were actually created for people who did not produce enough testosterone. There are people who use the variants, as you probably are aware, inappropriately, but they are out there for individuals who do not produce enough, just the same as we have as far as estrogen. And our last lipid is the phospholipids. So we had the fats, we have the sterols, And then we have the phospholipids. I'm not going to talk too much about the phospholipids because we're going to see these later on in chapter 4. But the phospholipids are the major component of the cell membrane. They're a little different compared to the other members of the lipids because they do have a hydrophobic part. So they have tails like a fat. So they have fatty acid tails. And that's the hydrophobic part. But the phospho part of phospholipid is what we call the head of the phospholipid. And it has a phosphate group in it, hence the phospho. And this section makes the head part hydrophilic. So phospholipids are part hydrophilic and part hydrophobic. So they still have the hydrophobic of the other parts of the lipids, but they also are hydrophilic. And so when you put phospholipids into water, they form structures like this and like the membranes that we'll see in chapter 4, where the hydrophobic tails will hide from the water. They hang out together because they're hydrophobic. They like hanging with each other away from the water. And the hydrophilic heads will point out towards the water because they like water. All right. So we'll see these guys again. So we'll see this symbol again. It looks like a two-legged stool with one of the legs kicked out. That's the end of the phospholipids. I'm going to go ahead and get started with proteins. So proteins are, out of all of the macromolecules, the most versatile. So these are used for a lot of the building molecules in bodies for organisms, whether it's a plant or an animal or a fungus or a bacteria. You're going to be built, your structure, out of proteins. But it's not just for structure, but a lot of other functions. So here are just some of the different functions for proteins. So proteins can work as structure. So they can be used to make hair, fingernails, feathers, horns, cartilage, tendons. In fact, all of these structures are made out of very similar types of proteins. You can also have protective proteins. So these are part of the immune system, fighting invading organisms like viruses and bacteria. The antibodies that you have probably heard of, especially with vaccines and so forth lately, the antibodies that our body makes, those are proteins. They're the little markers, the tags to say, hey, this guy doesn't belong here, come get him. The platelets that coagulate your blood whenever you get cut, those are also proteins. There are hormones. So we've got the steroid hormones that are lipids, but we also have proteins that are hormones. So there's a whole group of those guys that tell things when to turn on, when to turn off. When we think of proteins, the most common molecule that people think of are the ones that build up things like our muscles. So the contractile ones that allow our muscles to move for our legs and so forth, and our heart to pump. Also, these are the structures that allow things like sperm and cells to swim. And then we have protein molecules that can transport things. So what you're seeing in this picture here is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that is designed to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. So oxygen from your lungs to your cells, and then carbon dioxide from your cells back to your lungs. So wide variety of functions compared to the other macromolecules that we've seen so far and the one that we still have to see. So what do they have in common? Well, the one thing they have in common is what they're built out of. So just like carbohydrates are built out of monosaccharides, proteins are built out of amino acids. So there are lots of different types of amino acids. You can see there's 20 different types of amino acids. And the order of those amino acids determines how the protein's going to get put together. So they will get strung together to make a protein, kind of like beads on a string. The amino acid itself, this is what it looks like. So they all have this structure here in common. I'm not going to ask you to really know much about the structure. This, though, is the section that's going to get strung together. So this section, this amino group, is going to connect to the next amino acid's carboxyl group, and so on. So the chain is this section of the amino acids. Then all of the amino acids have different side chains. And the side chains are different combinations of atoms. So you can see that it can be just a single hydrogen atom, or they can be a carbon with 3 hydrogen atoms that are attached, or they can be big complicated ring structures. So that's how we know the 20 different types of amino acids. It's by their side chains. So these amino acids get strung together, and then they are going to be put together again to make the final protein. So before we talk about the structures of proteins, I do want to talk a little bit about protein as far as your diet. So you've probably seen food labels that say things like this contains carbohydrates, and it contains sugars and fiber, and then it has the fats, and it tells you saturated fats and unsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats and, all that different stuff. But the food label for protein just says protein. And the thing is that this is not actually enough information to determine whether you're going to have enough protein in that food. Because you can actually exceed your protein intake for the day, for the recommended amount, and not be eating healthy. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with things like a vegetarian or vegan diet, but you can actually be an unhealthy vegetarian or vegan, because if you're not taking in the correct proteins, and that's one of the main issues with those diets sometimes, that's why it's insufficient for you to know the item's just amount of protein. You need to know what kind of protein it is. So what am I meaning by this? Well, complete proteins have all of the essential amino acids. Turns out humans cannot make all of the amino acids. We need all 20 of them to build our proteins, but we can't make 8. We need to get 8 of them from our diet. And so we need to get 8 of them from the food that we eat. And complete proteins will be able to get those for us. So what kinds of foods do you think are going to be complete proteins? So probably you said something like chicken or beef or something like that. And yeah, anything that's a meat product definitely is a complete protein. There are a couple of plant products that are complete proteins we'll talk about here in a little bit. But definitely any meat products are going to be complete proteins because they're going to have all of those essential amino acids in them. Incomplete proteins, just simply, they're missing one or more of those essential amino acids, and there's a lot of those out there. So how can you get all of the essential amino acids if you don't want to eat meat? You can eat one of those few plants that actually has all of the essential amino acids, or you can eat what we call complementary proteins. Together they have the essential amino acids. So this would be, for example, we've got a lot of traditional dishes in cultures that are complementary proteins. So beans, and rice. So like any sort of beans and rice, like black-eyed peas and rice, or lentils. If you've had Indian food, it's lentils and rice. Those two make up the pairing of 2 items that have all the essential amino acids. For something like Mexican food, it would be corn and beans. You might notice that beans are usually involved here in some way. You need some sort of legume. So legumes are a group like beans, peas, things like that, that are picking up specific amino acids in their construction. So let's take a look at some of these complete versus incomplete with actual foods. So you can see here we've got apples. Apples are missing a bunch of these different amino acids that are essential amino acids. Almonds, better, but still missing a couple. White rice, you can see why you need to eat white rice with something else. So there's white rice and lentils. So those two together are going to be complementary. That's why they're lit up, because they each are missing one, but they have it, so they can cover each other. And then you can see the complete proteins over here. Like we said, meat, milk, so again, an animal product. But then here's one of the plants. This is why tofu is a big part of a lot of vegetarian and vegan diets, because tofu is a complete protein. Okay.